Today, March 31st, is your last day to get a Drake plushie. He's getting banished back to the Shadow Realm for crimes against human decency. So if you want to post his bail, you gotta click that link in the description. Code Drake15 gets you 15% off your order, so you better hurry, because at midnight tonight, he's getting yeeted. Greetings, adventurers, and welcome back to the Den of the Drake. Other dragons hoard gold, while I hoard internet cringe. If you're wondering why my voice sounds the way it does, it's because I'm sick as hell, but because I love all of you and hate the algorithm, I'm gonna push through whether or not it ends my life. Fingers crossed, everyone. So in D&D, there are two generalized avenues to how players may view their characters. Player A might get very attached to their character and insist on them being the most special little guy, where everything they do must be treated as a valiant quest where the fate of the world hinges on their success, even if it's something as little as buying a special ointment for that rash they don't like to talk about. Meanwhile, player B will take a moment, stare at their sheet, and say, "This guy, I can't wait to see him blow up." I will say I am a player B. I find that stories that get told organically just by letting your character be your character end up being of the highest chef's kiss quality. I'm not saying that player A can't tell good stories with their character, I'm just saying that there might be a bit more obstacles blocking their way. If you go into a D&D game with a non-negotiable expectation, then one of two things are gonna happen. You don't work with your DM and you're disappointed when they dare to focus on the side characters in your story, or you do work with your DM and you're no longer playing D&D. You're co-writing a fanfiction with a captive audience. The story I have for you today stars a DM who's in for a rude awakening when the cleric decides that this world belongs to them, and the rest of the party and the DM just live in it. Now, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right into the horrifying world of r/RPG horror stories. Enjoy. This week's story comes from Reddit user Amateur Moon and is titled "Player Tries to Play the Specialist Cleric Ever, Keeps Pushing for Inclusions of Discrimination, and then gives his next character a unique mental illness." This story has discussion and mentions of discrimination, but nothing overt and not any actual bigotry to people at the table. So I think it's time for a story from one of my own campaigns regarding arguably the worst player I had gotten. This is the story of Chuck, henceforth all names have been changed. His two attempts of roleplay, power gaming, and how the phrase "a unique mental illness" entered my vocabulary. Buckle in, this is a long one that covers technically two campaigns. Context first. I was about half a year into running my very first properly arranged homebrew campaign and decided to start another one. Something to keep in mind for this entire story is that there are certain topics I completely exclude from my games. Those are homophobia/queerphobia, racism against lineages present in the setting, and SA. These are a hard no. Players cannot attempt anything along these topics in-game, nor can they include them in their backstories. The setting was much more rigid, half the continent being ruled by an authoritarian theocratic regime. It was meant to be a campaign with a bit more structure than the first one I ran, and I quickly assembled the party. They don't really matter except for one, but for the sake of this I will mention them only briefly. Our cast: me, the DM, unaware of the mess I would be stepping into. Bracket, playing a halfling wizard. Honey, playing a tiefling blood hunter. Grim, playing a dragonborn druid. Ivy, playing a tiefling monk. Put a pin in this one. And finally, Chuck. Oh boy, he was playing an ASMR cleric. Chuck was a very interesting individual, and one of two people I gotten that I had not played with before. He seemed like someone who was really interested in role-playing and getting to know the party, though that illusion started falling away at character creation. See, there's this thing I've seen people do that I like to call role-play power gaming. You know how power gamers like to exploit and push mechanics to be good as possible at whatever they've set their eye on? Well, role-play power gamers are much the same, but instead of mechanics, they want to hand in everything on a roleplay/story level. To illustrate a summary of his character's backstory, let's call her Kim. Kim was an ASMR, blessed by the gods as she narrowly evaded dying in her infancy. Chuck really wanted to play a kitsune, and an ASMR inspired by that vibe was the closest we got. But that's not all. She was born into wealthy nobility, and from an early age trained in the arts of diplomacy to serve the overbearing empire. There she made many friends and found a partner, another ASMR, despite me explaining that they were a super rare occurrence, that she kept really close to. Okay, I kinda have to bring up that relationship. See, Kim is a woman, and Chuck decided to make her queer. Okay, cool. Absolutely, hell yeah. Her partner was another woman. Now, Chuck really wanted Kim's family to be against this union. Why? Chuck never gave me a straight answer, but judging by how he retracted that idea when I reminded him that homophobia was off the table, I could take a pretty solid guess. But that's not all. You wondering how Kim became a cleric? Well, she decided the Empire sucked actually, with no proper explanation given, and decided to just enlist the help of the God of Knowledge through tricking him to help her escape. This went poorly, but fear not, the God of the Arts stepped in, impressed by her stunt, and offered her patronage and protection. Yay. But that's not all. Kim makes her escape, ending up in a nation outside of the Empire where she is adopted into a family and treated as one of their own. So we have an ASMR cleric with ties to two gods, both main nations of the campaign, and connections to a swath of affluent people. There's nothing wrong in my eyes for a player to come from affluence and status and have ties in noble circles, if done in good faith. As I'll explain later, it was not. During this whole character creation thing, Chuck already showed a desire to prod my boundaries, so to speak. He kept asking about connections his character would have. Not in the way of, hey DM, what does my character know about the capital given she studied there? But more so, how can I give my character the most ties to everything going on? Chuck also initially didn't want his character to have any attachment to the campaign setting, and was pretty bummed out when I went, no, you should have a connection to the setting, that's how I run my games. I tried to push it for a bit and gave up. You might be wondering, if I don't like characters that have this much going on, why say yes? Well, because I was a relatively new DM, and I wasn't the best at gagging this sort of thing. And Chuck did it in a pretty sneaky manner. He gave me a pretty basic idea and kept sneaking things in continuously until the start and even during the campaign itself. Roleplay power gaming. I like that. It's a very real occurrence I've seen on more than one occasion, but the name needs some work. How about we use the working title role-preying, because they're preying on the DM's inability to say no in order to include themselves in literally everything. I would also like to put forward flower gaming, because they just need their characters to be a special little blooming flower that steals everyone else's sun. But yeah, I could see role-playing as not inherently malicious. If you play D&D because you enjoy combat, then you're gonna build your character in a way that's gonna get you the most opportunities to succeed in combat. So wouldn't it make sense to do the same thing if your favorite part of the game is roleplay? The problem comes from when you think about it for more than 2 seconds. If your character has an in to every situation, then that's gonna get annoying real quick to anyone else at the table. People often value what's rare. If you've shoehorned yourself into literally every interaction with every party member, guess what the rest of the players are going to remember the most fondly? That's right, the roleplay moments where you are gone. And do you really want to make a character that's only going to be enjoyed when they're absent? D&D is all about specialization. You got different classes that are good at different things, but people don't realize that specialization applies to backstories too. A character that has a little bit of everything sprinkled into their backstory is never going to be as interesting or enjoyable as a character that focuses squarely on 1 or 2 aspects of the world and how it shaped who they are as a person. Imagine a barbecue seasoning that blends every conceivable taste into one easily packageable container. Sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and savory all in one. You might think you have the ultimate all-purpose spice, but in reality, you only have a seasoning that's so ass that not only does it clash with whatever meat you put it on, but it also clashes with itself by its very nature. Life is too short to deal with crappy barbecue, and scheduling a D&D session is too hard that it's never worth suffering through crappy characters. Man, now I want some pork ribs when the only thing I can keep down is soup and Dayquil. Thanks, Chuck. Really appreciate it. Now the campaign kickstarted, and immediately there were more issues. At the time, I had a rule regarding how players could affect others worded in a stupid but direct manner. You cannot use charming/enchanting effects of that kind on other PCs. The only exception was if your character is being mind-controlled to act against the party. It's the first session, the group arrives and gathers in a tavern for an upcoming job. Kim is the last to arrive, and gets in just as the party is messing around doing some stupid fun shit. She decides to, as her goddamn opening intro, to charm Person the Druid to make him stop what he was doing. Now this is where I put my foot down. I said to Chuck that went directly against my Session 0 rules, and that his character doesn't do that. He seemed more annoyed than upset. To this day, I don't know if he genuinely forgot this ruling was in place or if he was purposefully ignoring it. There was also the issue of Chuck sleeping through the start of the first 2-3 sessions, because he decided to take a goddamn nap right before the session. I made sure the time was reasonable for those participating, and by the third time this happens, I'd wager someone realizes this kind of thing isn't working and stop. He only stopped because I outright told him if this happens again, I'll boot him. Whenever there was a character moment for another PC, Kim would find some way to insert herself in it and pull the spotlight over. After Chuck was told, both by me and others, that this was not very nice, and neither was casting spells on people without warning, and she would ask/inform them first, Kim was quiet and aloof for a few sessions, to the point of refusing to engage with the game. As in, the party was figuring out a skill challenge/puzzle, and Chuck just sat there in the call, with me having to prod him multiple times to participate. And now for the RP power gaming. You might have read the backstory Chuck gave me and thought, this is a fine backstory actually, this works well and I'm just complaining over nothing. And you're right. In isolation, it's honestly fine. I'd fine-tune some things, but that's just me. What was not fine was Chuck expecting nobles of the Empire to know who Kim's new family, well-off commoners from another country, were. Chuck expecting gods to grant Kim divine miracles for just thinking about them. Yes, both of them, even though I tried to make it clear that the god of knowledge wouldn't be a fan of her. Chuck insisting Kim would be the party leader, an implication and on occasion direct word. Chuck treating the rest of the party like stupid toddlers incapable of making their own decisions, without contributing to the decision-making at all. Chuck being surprised that I refused Kim having status and privilege in the Empire, giving her fleeing. The issues were mounting, and honestly, it would have probably led to his removal soon enough. But something complicated things. I'll be upfront, I did a bad job running this version of the campaign. Not world-building it in an interesting way and getting disheartened by it way too quickly. And so after about 2 to 3 months of lackluster sessions, I gathered the party and told them I would be rebooting the campaign. The lore got some much-needed editing and polish. The premise was made much more distinct, and overall I'm much happier with the new campaign and how it's turning out. But this meant an important discussion. What to do with the PCs. I ended up working on an individual base to figure out how to manage this. It would be one of 3 outcomes. The character stayed the same with minor changes to integrate them into the setting, the character would be reworked significantly, and the character would be switched completely. Brackett switched characters to a Warforged fighter. Grim kept his druid more or less the same. Honey kept the concept but switched to a rogue. Ivy, oh hey, a pin, ouch, kept their concept but wanted to refine it some more. And Chuck, well, Chuck really wanted his kitsune girl, but I gently pushed him to do something different, because Kim was a deeply frustrating character. Chuck didn't mind this push too much, though. Instead, he made another cat girl adjacent cleric concept. We'll call her Kit. Kit was a literal cat girl. He wanted her to be a tabaxi meant to resemble a wildcat with a very particular unique fur color and pattern. I was fine with that, until Chuck dropped the actual concept. The initial idea involved Kit getting kidnapped by the equivalent of slavers to eventually have her fur sold to someone. Obviously, this was immediately denied. See point about slavery being off the table. What followed was a pretty short argument about how, yes, this is essentially kidnapping someone with the intent to essentially skin someone. Eventually, the concept pivoted and came to something like this. The idea was so convoluted that this is the most I can recall. I'm not denying my brain might have misconstrued some things to make it more understandable. Kit was an herbalist/healer living in a small, isolated village that got attacked by a tribe of werewolves. The village was slaughtered, but Kit was spared for some reason, and infected with a form of lycanthropy by the alpha of the pack. His words, not mine. Also, ew. She managed to escape and get to another town, where she was adopted by a family and continued her studies of herbalism. Now the concept is disjointed, but once again not that bad. However, Chuck at one point approached me with a very odd idea. He started this talk by proclaiming directly, "I've been having ideas for Kit. See, she has this unique mental illness." Now, this was already kind of wildly stupid and abrasive. The actual idea was essentially that after the traumatic slaughter of her village, she hallucinates this Grim Reaper figure, even though the Grim Reaper is not a thing in my setting, and that was explained to him. He was on the fence about whether he wanted this to be an actual specter or a hallucination, and talked about it in a way that would make anyone who's ever dealt with hallucinations, myself included, pretty uncomfortable. I said I'd think about it, but wasn't too happy about it. Also, at the end of that talk, I learned that this was inspired by some anime/Vocaloid song where a lonely guy falls in love with the spirit of death meandering by. No clue what the intention with this idea was. Chuck made her a cleric. Knowledge, I think? The domain really doesn't matter. He wanted her to be a nature-focused healer and herbalist. He refused to put in effort in terms of really, explaining why Kit worshipped the god he went with. But it's whatever in comparison to everything else. Oh right, that pin. So Ivy approached me about her character being a healer and a medicine man first. And in terms of ideas, my campaign is kinda first come, first serve. I want everyone to feel unique, and for people to properly play off each other. So when Chuck approached me about Kit being a healer/apothecary, I was hesitant. I told him that I didn't mind, under the condition that he discussed it with Ivy and they settled what the differences between this part of their character was. Chuck agreed to this and messaged Ivy something along the lines of, "Hi, DM said that we should talk about our characters." I told Ivy to expect this message, so Ivy knew the situation and responded in kind. The conversation did not go anywhere, because Chuck refused to actually explain what I asked the two of them to discuss. He avoided my questions on if the two of them talked. I knew they didn't because Ivy told me. This was irritating, but not the last of it. Chuck really wanted Kit to have a mentor character. Okay, an attempt to connect the characters to the world. Yay, I'll take it. He wanted the mentor to be a shifter, I think, and wanted them to have been exiled from a particular city. No clue why. I was eager to help him flesh this guy out, so I asked why he had been exiled and was met with, maybe he was met with vitriol and scrutiny because of his shifter nature. At this point, I was done. I told him to stop and reminded him that this kind of theme was not allowed and ended the conversation for the day. So before I begin, I want to make it very clear that this is OP's game and they can do whatever they want, and it's mega cringe to try and tell people how to run their own personal games. RPGs are not the same as published media intended for a broader audience. If the content is enjoyed by the DM and all the players, then it is enough. That being said, I would be lying if I said I didn't somewhat understand Chuck's frustrations here. I understand that you're trying to avoid parallels to real life because at the end of the day, D&D is about escapism, and you don't want to ruin that for anyone, including yourself. And Chuck wanting to include straight-up homophobia earlier in the story is a clear violation of those clearly set boundaries. But at some point, you gotta ask yourself when it goes too far to being just abject sterilization. Intolerance and suffering are facts of life. Some of the greatest stories ever written by man stem from overcoming intolerance and showing how good people can influence meaningful change. So I'm actually a pretty big fan of Kit's original backstory. As most of my viewers know, I am super involved in the world of zoology and conservation, and know better than most how hugely devastating black market poaching can be to a species' continued existence. The idea of a hunters guild becoming corrupted into tabaxi poachers for the sake of financial gain sounds like some fertile ground for the development of some really good and nuanced villainy. Hell, you already have a whole totalitarian empire whose industry presumably thrives on the suffering of the oppressed. Maybe tabaxi fur and meat is a luxury good among the unapologetically evil upper class, and entire factions have begun to spring up to fill the demand for the promise of coin, regardless of the sentience of their chosen quarry. That tabaxi character can have a badass arc about tearing down the system both literally and figuratively, by proving to the world that tabaxi are more than just animals despite how different they are from the non-beast races. There are a ton of interesting possibilities for storytelling that are shut down immediately for seemingly arbitrary reasons that really make the world seem less immersive. Like this shifter mentor, for example. Admittedly, I'm not sure if OP is referring to a changeling or the lycanthrope stand-in from Monsters of the Multiverse, so I'm gonna go ahead and address both. If it's a changeling we're talking about, well, the idea of a creature who can change itself to mimic the appearance and voice of anyone at any time is objectively terrifying. There's a reason why the monster that mimics people it has killed trope has become so common. Being unable to trust other people or even your own senses is an innate human fear that monsters like doppelgangers and mimics take full advantage of. Even if it was established that shifters were super common in your setting and everyone was aware of them, it makes sense that there would be a significant amount of distrust towards a creature whose entire existence is based around deception. And if you're referring to a lycanthrope, well, it's really not unreasonable to feel uneasy around a guy who can transform into a monster known for literally tearing people limb from limb. Realism and immersion are not everything, of course, and it is your game. But I don't think Chuck deserves such a dramatic reaction just because you made such a huge stretch to sniff out an offense where most people wouldn't have. Just my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, but I don't think that this extreme level of sterilization of themes and conflicts will do anything other than severely limit yourself and your player's storytelling capabilities for next to no payoff. The next day, I messaged everyone else in the group, asking them how they genuinely felt about Chuck and his participation in the group. I was leaning into removing him, but wanted to know everyone's opinions. To not that much surprise, no one was happy with him being there, ranging from neutral to quite directly telling me that they had no confidence Chuck's bullshit from the previous iteration of the campaign wouldn't repeat. With that, my confidence was settled, and he was promptly chucked, from my campaign and server. I wrote a rather detailed message about how his attitude in and out of game was not suitable for my table. I got met with a plethora of, "What did I do?" and was done with it. That campaign's still going strong. They're level 11 now. We got in a player to substitute Chuck, who is a delight to play with and makes incredibly fascinating characters. A few players and character changes happened, but it's been a blast. No unique mental illnesses in sight. Edit. I think I should clarify the whole thing of theocratic empire versus no queerphobia/racism in my games. 1. I'm queer. I'm sorry that I, as a queer person who deals with transphobia on a daily basis, don't want to have that shit in the game I'm running. Apologies if I don't want to portray a homophobic NPC. 2. Discrimination in a fantasy setting separate from the real world can be very different. Some lore. The setting in question is a continent in a larger setting I run all my games in that suffered a massive wave of all sorts of natural disasters over the course of centuries. This instilled a fear of primal/druidic magic in people, and therefore those that used it, which the budding empire took to their advantage, using as a common enemy that they must weed out. They even made a task force for it. The empire doesn't welcome druids, period, and using overtly primal magic in front of law-abiding citizens can get you in a lot of trouble. The rest of the continent is not the biggest fan either, but they like what the empire is doing even less. Okay, so first part of the edit, totally justified minus the weird passive aggressiveness. No one has the right to force you to play a character that you are uncomfortable portraying. And I'm sure that inviting that sort of thing into your D&D game when you already experience it in your real life is not a pleasant experience for anyone involved, so good on OP for holding their ground. But I got beef with the second part of the edit. So is there discrimination in your setting or not, OP? Druidic magic is presented as a quasi-religious practice in the D&D setting and was/is a real religious practice in our world. I would argue that an evil empire seeking to use an entire religious group as a scapegoat for events outside of their control to justify the mass extermination of an entire population has way more parallels to real-world events than Chuck suggesting that a magical shapeshifter might freak some people out. If I were Chuck, I'd be plenty confused on why I keep getting shut down, considering how the setting's main conflict is just the Crusades and World War II thrown into a whimsical fantasy blender. Is that an unreasonable stretch? Of course it is, but it's an unreasonable stretch that aligns with the standard that OP chooses to enforce with an iron fist. Plus, couldn't a mentor character turning into a tiger or wolf easily be reflavored as a form of primal magic? Druids turn into animals all the time, and you point blank stated that they are unwelcome in your setting, so how come shifters get a pass? After the edit, now it just kind of feels like OP was being needlessly obtrusive at times. I know the edit was an attempt to justify the severe tonal mismatch between a world where even the bad guys are tolerant of everyone and the main conflict being resisting a theocratic totalitarian empire, but it only really served to make that mismatch even worse while making the repeated pearl clutching just seem kinda hypocritical. All that being said, it is OP's game and they are by no means obligated to justify themselves to me or anyone for that matter, and especially not Chuck. Yeah, I directed some criticism towards OP this video, but let's not let that distract us from the fact that Chuck is quite a piece of work. Severe main character syndrome, a ceaseless desire to push every established boundary, initiating PvP in literal session 1, lacking the respect to even stay awake during sessions, and multiple weeb-related crimes. Oh boy, do I pity the group that he ends up saddling himself with next. Also, what's up with all the kitsune-obsessed people ending up being total freaks? I mean, if any kitsune enjoyers out there want to go and prove me wrong, go ahead, but I'm starting to see a pattern with these fox yokai yokai enthusiasts. Yeah, I googled what a yokai is, I'm cultured. Between that and the fact that I've been eating ramen out of styrofoam cups my whole life and you can start calling me Mr. Worldwide. OP, despite all my criticisms, I'm happy that your game is going well and is fun for you and your players. Maybe the real unique mental illness was the friends we made along the way. But you know who's got the most flavorful kind of mental illness? The artists who send me fan art. That's right, how about we take a look at this week's Gallery of the Drake. This week's fan art comes from viewer Transmasked Tiefling, and back in the 2020s, I was in a very famous oh, believe it or not, but this is not the first time the Drake character has been compared to BoJack Horseman, and I'd be lying if I didn't take that as the ultimate compliment. Todd, your good-hearted naivety has once again conspired with outrageous happenstance to completely dick me over. Clean up your shit, Todd. Thank you again, Transmasked Tiefling, for submitting your art. If you'd like to see your art featured in Gallery of the Drake, be sure to send it to the email in my About section, or upload it to the official Den of the Drake subreddit, linked in the description, along with any social media you want me to shout out. Fan art is my favorite part of doing YouTube, and it means the world to me that I can inspire artists like you to create artwork like this. With the story over and artwork displayed, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and send in your fan art. And if you feel like supporting the channel further, my Patreon and merchandise links are in the description. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you next time in the Den of the Drake.